Okay, we should be live. Sorry, we're starting a couple of minutes late. So welcome to our webinar on tailoring content and processes for panel recruitment. So I'm Jess Lewes, the Business Development Director here at People for Research. We always have a special guest on our webinars, which if anyone is joining us for the second time or more, you'll know. This month we're lucky enough to be joined by Maria Santos, who's our Head of Marketing and Data Protection at People for Research.
Hello.
This webinar was inspired by a workshop that we did in June of this year at User Research London. We've taken the workshop tasks out, so obviously that'd be a little bit challenging to do over a webinar, but we're still sharing the content from the workshop that we ran. Here's briefly what we're going to be going through today. I can skip on to my next slide. I'm just going to give a bit of context to People for Research, just in case anyone doesn't know much about us, so you know kind of the context that we're speaking from, a little bit about how we recruit and the tools that we use, and well, Maria will take over at that point, and then she's going to share some guidelines on panel recruitment, share some practical examples, and then we've got time at the end for a Q&A. So if you have questions as we go through, please feel free to submit them through the sort of chat feature on GoToWebinar, and we'll pick those up at the end. So a bit of context to People for Research. We've been around over 25 years recruiting people to take part in research, but in the last sort of, I don't know, 5 to 7 years, we've really specifically focused on supporting the UX sector. And most of the projects that we recruit for are part of big digital transformations, might be usability testing, might be user research. And what we found is that more projects have multiple rounds of research. We're recruiting for projects at an earlier phase, so supporting discovery research, not just usability testing that's happening at the end of the process. There are much more tools available to support the work that our clients are doing. We're working with more companies who have their own internal UX departments as well, which means needs are sometimes more complex. And there's a lot more investment in UX, which is awesome. But all of that has resulted in us having to kind of tailor our processes a lot more and think about new ways of approaching the recruitment. So what is recruitment? Again, this is for anyone who is maybe hasn't done recruitment and is embarking on it for the first time and joined this hoping for all the answers. Is it just booking people into time slots? Perhaps not. Once upon a time, I think maybe when I first joined, it was a lot more simple and it was a case of just finding people who could attend. But actually now there's a lot more to it. So it's much more important that we find people that meet very specific criteria. Our role is also in promoting the concept of user research. You know, a lot of people still know about market research and going along and to a focus group and eating biscuits and saying which ones they like, but the idea of user research is still actually a bit of a newer concept that a lot of people aren't aware about. So trying to get people engaged in what we're actually doing and the work that's going on behind the scenes to improve all of our digital experiences. It's really important that our role, in our role, that we recognise how important it is to reassure people who we're including in research about what to expect. For example, I've been asked in the past, do I need to wear a suit? You know, is it a formal interview scenario? People really honestly don't know what to expect sometimes. And also gaining informed consent. Informed consent is something that's there to protect the participant. It allows them the chance to fully consent to participating based on knowing exactly what's involved. And that includes things like, are they comfortable with being filmed or recorded in some way, which most research we support is recorded in some way.
And it is a legal requirement now.
It's a legal requirement to get that consent. We also always like to show the task model that's on this slide now, because it really helps to give some context if, you know, if you've never worked with a recruiter, you've never recruited people yourselves, maybe you run research but not sat on this side of the desk. This is a task model that came out of some research done by two Southwest-based user researchers, Nick Price and Ben Cubbon. There's a link there to the Medium post where you can access an article about this and the work that they've done. They did research into the participants' needs during the research process, starting right from that trigger point where they first find out about the research. And that's going to be the focus for the rest of the webinar, that very early point where we're trying to get a message out there to the right people, relevant people, to tell them that there's a research opportunity that they might be able to take part in. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that from the participants' point of view, all of this is the research process. They don't distinguish between, oh, I'm now being recruited, now I'm in the research process. And that users have needs during every journey, which, you know, if we've got user researchers listening, yes, I'm probably preaching to the converted, you know all of this, but remembering that they also have needs during the recruitment part of the research journey. So I'm now going to hand over to Maria at this point to carry on the webinar.
So hi, like Jess said at the beginning of the webinar, my name is Maria. I'm the head of marketing and data protection at People for Research. And I'm just going to start my section of the webinar by sharing a bit about how we recruit at People for Research and the role that the marketing team plays in the recruitment process. So just some context in the about the team, which is responsible for all communications with participants. It's kind of like the middleman between the users and the project team that then recruit the participants. And our job is great, and we do a lot in this process, but it's sometimes also very challenging because we do work in a niche industry, and that sometimes means that there's nowhere to turn to find answers to challenges. But on the bright side, we are also, as we learn and we evolve, we are also setting standards in the industry. So how we usually find participants. So we run one of the UK's biggest active participant databases, which is grown through strategic techniques that we apply that are part of our yearly strategy, and also through targeted campaigns. One of the main things we try to do is to keep the process fun, and the process of being part of this online community that we try to build, and also the sense of building a community. So trying to make people feel like they belong to a group that is actually helping to make a difference by improving digital products and experiences. We do a lot of rewards and giveaways, for example, and with most of our projects, we'll go to our database first, and sometimes even just to our database. But sometimes we need to go outside of it and use free-find methods. So these include, for example, paid advertising on social media, online research, customer lists that clients may be able to provide to us, and also establishing partnerships with charities, organizations, you name it, yeah, there's so many options. And here I'm just gonna share some examples of actually that I'm gonna use throughout the workshop, the webinar. I still have my User Research London hat on, where we did this workshop. So throughout the webinar, I'm going to use these audiences to share some examples of how we've adapted our process towards building something that is more like a panel to match the client requirements for some projects. So for example, in the past, we've recruited vulnerable audiences for sensitive research. So for example, we worked with the Alzheimer's Society, recruiting people who were worried about having early symptoms of dementia. We've also recruited people who had experienced mental health issues in the past or at the time of the recruitment. So for example, with this audience, it was very challenging, the communication with them, because you have to understand that they are potentially vulnerable, and you have to adapt your recruitment process to be extra ethical and have use empathy to the most as much as you can, just to make sure you're connecting with them at a deeper level. With adopters of emerging tech, so for example, we have people who have used specific virtual reality headsets, AR apps, people who own digital assistants like Alexa. So this is another interesting one, because if you're building a panel, for example, with adopters of emerging tech, you need to adapt the recruitment process to be able to cater to these new audiences, because these are new products. This means potentially a new audience that you're not really sure about how it's composed and who's in it. So who are these people? Where are they? I'm going to show later how we adapted our process and the concerns that we had when we recruited these people. And also business owners and senior professionals. So for the next few slides, I'm going to focus on this audience quite a bit, because this is a particularly challenging audience, and one that we've had quite a lot of experience in the last few years. They can be quite difficult to engage. You need to understand what motivates them, because it's not necessarily the incentive all the time. And how do you keep them interested in the long term, which is especially relevant if you want to have a panel for multiple rounds or multiple projects, or if you're working with a client in the long term, if you're in an agency, for example. So with business owners and people in senior roles and niche industries, and you have two examples on the slide. So people who import or export goods to and from specific locations, an audience that has been of particular interest because of Brexit, for example. And then you have people who use niche software in their jobs, for example, as well. So with this audience, and due to the interest we've had over the last few years, we've actually decided to build a business panel separate from our main database, the one I mentioned a few slides back. And we decided to do this because we realized actually that our regular recruitment process had to be adapted to work with them and to just engage them where our recruitment process maybe wasn't delivering. We needed to adapt those steps to make it work for this audience. So with in our process of building this business panel, we started by identifying problems with the processes we were using. So, and we highlighted 4 reasons why they didn't engage with our journey. And this is, I think, if you're thinking about building a panel and you're not really sure, you already have a kind of a process, but you're stepping into the challenge of recruiting a new group for your projects. This is probably the first step to take, is that if you're finding issues with recruiting and engaging and maintaining these people in a panel, then you need to look at where the process is maybe not catering to them. So we highlighted a few challenges, like, for example, the main message wasn't catering to the business owners. The way our sign-up and application processes work was also not really suited to their routines. We weren't able to target properly because, and this is a really big one, we weren't collecting the right data that we needed to keep in the long term. This was leading to poor segmentation, poor personalization of the message, very, very low click-through rates and open rates in email campaigns, for example. And also, we weren't establishing our presence in the right places, so the right social media platforms, for example. Obviously, to identify the problems, we had to use some tools, and these are just 3 of the tools we used and that we focused on. So reporting and analytics, if you work in UX, you know, or in marketing, for example, you know it's not worth doing anything without having the ability to report on your goals that you set at the beginning. So it may be true that sometimes reports or analytics are a bit useless or a bit confusing, but if you're looking at the right metrics and you're reporting on them in the long term, then you're going to be able to find some the right metrics that you need to look at to identify the issues. So, for example, with the business people, we knew that looking at the analytics of our sign-up and application process, there were 2 very specific points where they were dropping out. But if we weren't looking at the numbers, we wouldn't have noticed that. We also knew from previous feedback surveys that we run with our regular database that one of the biggest complaints we had from participants was that we weren't really personalizing the message, and we were maybe sending email campaigns to people that weren't necessarily suitable for the projects. So this was obviously a problem with the business participants because we didn't have the right data to target them and send them the proper message. And then finally, I mean, for business people, participants, time is money. So we had to get kind of in that mindset and make our approach more direct and more to the point that is relevant for them. So now that I've gave you a few practical examples of how we started by highlighting what was needed to build this business panel that we are managing at the moment, I'm just gonna share with you the 5 golden rules that we learned whilst we were setting up the panel and starting to manage it. So the first rule is adapting your content to your audience. And these may all sound very obvious, but I'm gonna go into them a bit more to share a few more practical tips on how we apply these. So mirroring your audience's behavior when you're communicating with them, and this is particularly important for the vulnerable audiences, for example. Using unambiguous language, so informative content for business owners, a clear call to action, what is required of them, what is the benefit for them. And then test, just find out what kind of content works for them, because you need that. You're going to see that a lot in the next few slides, the references to testing. Next, we have going where your users are. So if you have a diverse audience, it's likely that they are spread across different platforms, for example, on social media or online forums. So depending on the segmentation you need to do to reach the right people, you're going to need to find where your groups are. Also, this means usually, because organic reach on social media, for example, is so low at the moment, this usually means having to pay to show them your message and your content, and this means researching advertising options. And finally, once again, A/B test your content, especially if you're spending money to promote it, because you want to know what works best. What is it? An image with a face? Is it an image with something that relates to the topic of the research? So yeah, just test. That's one of the biggest recommendations. And also allow yourself to be flexible enough to make improvements as you go along. Next tip, keep them engaged. So follow up with your panel when they show interest in a project. Don't just leave them hanging, and make sure that they know what is going to happen next. If you can, I know it's not always possible, but if you can apply any gamification principles and try to make the process a bit more fun and interesting, and this is particularly relevant if, for example, you're running research with adopters of emerging tech, gamers, for example. That is a really obvious one, I know. But also if you're running diary studies over the course of a long period, because that works really well, just keeping people engaged and showing them, for example, a progress load bar, which is something we did recently with a diary study we recruited for. And providing answers to questions. If your participants have questions, just go back to them right away. Don't make them wait, because that might be what makes a difference for them between being comfortable enough to participate in a project that you're recruiting for. And also you want to keep people engaged in the long term. And especially, again, I'm going back to the example of the vulnerable audiences. You need to pay attention to people that might need a bit more care. Right, next one, making them feel like they belong. This is not only a recommendation, this is also, if you're designing a product, you should make it accessible. So using inclusive language, and actually we published a case study today, a guest blog with Atomic Smash on the importance of inclusive language when redesigning the website. They redesigned the website for Bristol Pride. So it was really interesting to find out from them, as we worked on the content together, the steps they went through to make sure that the language was catering to their audience. And obviously, accessibility, usability, user-friendly processes and tools. You need to design for the, I think we have on the blog, someone once wrote on a guest blog, design for the 5%, so the 100%, everyone can use it. And that is so important. This is probably one of the most important recommendations, because otherwise, why would people be in your panel if you can provide them with an accessible tool that they can use or a process? Right, the final one, keeping them informed. So make sure that your participants are aware of your processes. Make sure they know the journey, what to expect. Again, particularly important with vulnerable people. People who may be very concerned about the information they're sharing, make sure they know they can drop out at any moment also, and that it's completely their choice on what they share, how they share it, when they share it, if they don't want to share it anymore. Keep them up to date if you change your process, if you change the way you process that data, for example, or if you need to share that data with a client and you didn't realize at the beginning. Be transparent again. So this is a lot. There's a lot of GDPR focus here. Being transparent with the way you collect, store, process your data, how participants can request for their data to be deleted, and the last one is basically a summary of this slide. Just be ethical with your recruitment process. That is the most important thing, and believe me, it works for all audiences. Right, so we've talked through the 5 golden rules guidelines that we wanted to highlight when building and managing a panel. And now, how do you put these guidelines into practice? So I've listed a few examples, and I've been going back to them in the last few slides about real recruitment challenges we dealt with in the past and currently as well. So I'm just going to now share how we actually applied these guidelines to then help us successfully recruit these specific groups of people. So with vulnerable participants, being aware of the audience and be sensitive, show empathy, dedicate time to each one of them. You're probably not going to have a massive group of people if you're dealing with these sensitive audiences, because you need to spend more time making sure that they feel listened to. So I think it's important here to strive for quality, not necessarily quantity. Show them how their feedback can make a difference if you can. Just let them know that this is something that will help people that have been through the same problem that they are going through, that they've been through. Fully prepare them ahead of the research as well. So this may include, for example, sending an introduction to the researchers. So let's say you're someone who has early symptoms of dementia. There's a researcher going to their house, where even a carer may be with them. But it's good practice to send a small introduction. You can just send an attachment in an email to them, just to show this is a researcher that's going to be visiting you at this time. This is a little bit about them. That is just good practice, and that makes the participants so much more comfortable and makes them more likely to have a good experience and therefore to want to stay in your panel. And then follow up with each participant after the session if you can. We know that's time consuming, but I mean, if you can gain their feedback, that's just gold right there. It allows you to improve your processes in the long term, and it kind of gives them closure. It creates an end-to-end process. And that's really positive for participants that may be in a vulnerable situation. So next example, adopters of emerging tech. So how we applied the guidelines that I listed in the previous section to this audience was, so do your research about the technology that you want to test with before recruiting your audience, so you can ask the right questions at the beginning during the screening process, and even so you can tailor the content when you're first getting their attention on social media, for example. Making sure the users know what to expect from the sessions is also really important, because it actually may be even more attractive for them to want to take part if they're going to test I don't know, a really new VR headset or new controllers or something. Some people really love having access to new technology, and with this case, that's obviously the reason why they are adopters of emerging tech. And finally, be flexible. I mean, don't really get caught up in whether participants are already users of a specific product or they have a specific behavior towards a product. This can be a real trap, because with emerging tech, the number of users can be quite low if it's a really new product, and very difficult to recruit from, or very difficult to have in a panel. So just focus on how likely they are to adopt products. This is a good this is good advice, I think, for panels in general, because Focusing on likelihood of adopting future behaviors is a really good way of growing your panel. And in the long term, people are likely to exhibit those behaviors. So you're just going to have suitable people, and you're going to prevent the need to recruit for projects right before the project happens. And then finally, going back to the business participants. So don't rush content planning. A very personalized and segmented approach was the key for us to getting these people engaged, and still is. And also making it relevant for the audience and segmenting the groups based on specific project requirements. This might even mean that for one project or one session, you have to contact different groups separately, so you can successfully approach every segment that you need to recruit for the research testing session, whatever you're doing, really. And then business people and senior professionals, just keep that in mind, are usually quite time poor and not necessarily focused on the incentive as the main motivation. So with them, we found it useful to make them aware that how important their feedback is to help shape a product that is likely to be useful for them in the future. So we've just been through the 3 audiences, and these are my, I think these are the main ways we adapted the guidelines into reality and into these recruiting these audiences. And let's have a slide about everyone's favorite subject, GDPR. And the importance of obviously being transparent and responsible with your users' data, really regardless of who your audience is. So just a few examples. With the business owners, for example, we learned that it was important to reassure them that they would never be asked to share any confidential business data during recruitment process sessions throughout the entire process. If you're asking questions about special data, include a disclaimer in your questionnaire screener ahead of the collection of the data. So this may include questions about ethnicity, sexual orientation, health, disabilities, particularly important for vulnerable audiences, for example. And also don't forget that in the UK, that includes questions about criminal record. So just keep this in mind. Special data is something that requires consent to be collected at all stages. Every time you ask about this kind of special data, you have to renew consent. Make sure you record consent also. So this is informed consent, not special consent. During the recruitment stage, if you're filming or recording audio during the sessions, so consent can be given verbally, but it's best to keep a log of when it was provided. It's just in case you need to revert back to your records if there's any questions about the participant consenting to something that is part of the session. And finally, making sure the participants can easily obtain information on how you store, process, collect, transfer data, if applicable. Just make sure you're really transparent with what you do with their data. And if you're sharing with any third parties, just make sure that, because you may be running a panel for an agency that will share data with the end client, just make sure that all of that is very clear when you're talking to the participants and including them in a panel potentially. And those are all that's all my advice.
Very good.
Yeah,
excellent. Thank you.
Got caught up by the end of it.
You just wanted to keep talking about GDPR.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so questions. We've had a couple through. So if anyone's got other questions as well, feel free to fire them through. But we'll just start with how big should a panel be?
Right.
That's a bit like asking how long should a piece of string be, in a sense, because it really depends on quite a lot of factors, wouldn't you say?
I completely agree. So there's no 2 panels that are the same. So I think the important thing is at the beginning, start by asking the relevant questions. So how long, how often are you going to need to recruit from this panel, this pool of people? How many audiences, so like different personas, behaviors, product owners with different devices, you're going to need to have in the same pool of people. How niche are the profiles? Because obviously, if they're niche, you have fewer people to recruit from in the general public. And also, this is going to determine as well how likely or unlikely they are to engage. Another question is, can you rebook them or not? Between sessions. So can you, do they have anything else to offer? Do you actually have different iterations of the same product that you want the same participants to look at? So I would say there is a lot of initial research to do when you're setting up a panel, and then it really depends on how much time you have to grow it as well. I would say that there's no limit for a panel as long as you have the ability to manage it properly. That's the main, I think.
Yeah, I think possibly this is where it's useful to think about the advice you gave about testing, because if, for example, someone's thinking of setting up, because there's no context with the question, if someone's thinking of setting up a panel, and that's going to be a group of people that you want to go back to and say, right, we've got some more research who's available on this date, and keep reaching out to them. It's important to kind of test and see what sort of response rate you're getting back, and actually if the response rate maybe is quite low or is getting lower every time you re-engage with them, that might be a signal for you to build that panel a bit more. If that panel is as a result of you maybe working with your marketing team internally to engage with your customers, it might be you need to monitor that, go to your marketing team and say, right, I think I might need to send out another message, get some more people to put themselves forward to be in this sort of like testing panel that we've built up. And I think defining what panel means, because lots of people have a different understanding. Like some people refer to our database, for example, as a panel, which I don't know if that's how I would refer to it, because it's a sort of more of a database. It's more a sort of shifting, moving thing, and we use it for lots of different projects, and we can set up small panels within that for specific clients and specific groups of people, in the way that we've done with the business to business one. So hopefully we've answered that question, but it really depends on what you need it for, and then use some of the principles Maria shared about testing, seeing what your response rate is like, and that being a bit of a guide as to how many you think would be a good number. That is exactly,
that's a really important part of the answer, actually. What is the engagement rate you're getting when you're trying to communicate with them? Because that is determined by a lot of factors, and that will determine a lot of like the processes you put in place to grow it. Because obviously there's going to be people also dropping out of your panel. That's inevitable. You can avoid that, and GDPR just makes sure that people have the right to ask, for example, for all of their data to be deleted, and that can be prevented initially by segmenting the message. It's what we found when improving our process, but it's still inevitable. Some people are still going to want to drop out from your panel, and you just have to prepare for that, and you just have to have growth strategy in place. Because
I think probably people will sign up not knowing exactly what it is that they're signing up for, and then they'll realise, oh, actually I didn't realise that I have to go to a place. Because people, what we've also found is people don't read things. So you might sort of be really clear and say, we want you to opt into being in this thing. It will involve being invited to in-person research sessions, but whether people take that on board or not.
One of the things, sorry, just to add a quick guideline that we use, one of the things we do with all of our sign-up processes, so with our database and our panel, is we never send people, if doing, for example, paid advertising, it's not very usual that we send people to the sign-up page directly. We always send them somewhere where they can find out more about us first, unless they are previously engaged with us and they know about us and we know that. If it's the first time, or it's likely to be the first time they are getting to know us, we ask them to at least go to a page where they can read about us, and then they make a decision to sign up. But that leads to a lot more engagement, and not just having a spike of signups and people joining and then all of them leaving, because that is not what they thought it would be.
So again, if you're sort of testing the same benchmarks, you can monitor that and see the impact. Okay, so this question is there a difference between a user research panel and a user research community? We want to keep users long-term for various pieces of work every 6 weeks, or is a panel focused on one-off projects? Yeah, I think maybe I might have already kind of answered this a bit in that different people use the word panel to refer to different things. I think partly it depends as well on how easy it is for you to communicate with this group of people. For example, if you're working in a large corporate organisation where you want to be talking to your customers, but there are processes in place that prevent you from easily reaching out, then panel might be a good word to refer to something that, excuse me, you're building with support from your marketing team. Community might be more about engaging with people that aren't necessarily users or customers, etc., of your service.
I would compare the two groups in this question to what we have actually in place. So a user research panel would be more our business panel, which is composed of one big audience with one thing that is common to all of them, which is they are either business owners or they work in business, or they are senior professionals, or they have very niche jobs. So it's all around what they do for a living. And then the user research community, I compare that more to our database, which is where we have a big mix of people of all kinds of backgrounds, owners of all kinds of devices with all kinds of occupations. And we recruit from that pool of people for really different projects, I mean, on a daily basis. So I would say that the description that came with this question, and just trying to go back directly to this person who's attending the webinar, it sounds more like they are trying to build kind of a database, I would say, because it sounds like various pieces of work could mean different topics or different products.
Yeah, whereas a panel might be something we've worked with a client in the past, for example, who wanted 45 people, 15 from 3 clear customer groups, and they wanted those 45 people to participate in research over a 3-month period that involved very specific interactions on a weekly basis to give feedback on a potential new service. And that's a much more defined group of people. They know that they've opted in for a specific period. They know they're going to be contacted on a Tuesday with a task, and they have to complete it, and they get a little bit of, a voucher or cash on a weekly or monthly basis. And we often use the word community to refer to our database because it is, again, a group of people that people within that community aren't necessarily even people that are registered on our database, because we know we have access to people beyond those who are just signed up with us, because we do a lot of stuff through word of mouth. Okay, so let's just move on because we've only got a short bit of time left. Do you use cold calling?
Right, interesting question. I would say that, first of all, if you already have a panel in place, and this is really, if you can use cold calling or not, this is really depending on what situation you're in. Does that make sense? So I would say that, first of all, just make sure that if you are to go cold call your panel members, and I'm assuming you already have a panel in place, you have the consent to do so. That is the most important thing. Cold calling is fine as long as people have agreed to it, because they can always say, I don't want you to cold call me anymore after 1 call or 2 calls or 3 calls. It's up to you how many times you want to call them. But also put yourself in the shoes of the users. So if, for example, actually cold calling can be really a really good way of engaging with people if your panel is composed of people who are not comfortable with technology. So it could actually be the right way to engage with these people. It's to cold call them. Sorry, that's a difficult combination of words to say. Cold call them to take part in projects. But for example, then if you have a business owner who is more likely to prefer an email instead of a call in the middle of a busy day in the office or in transport to another location, they wouldn't probably like to get interrupted by a call unless it's something, it's the case where you know they are suitable to take part in something and you just want to book them in. You're not trying to screen them for anything. So I think you need to use common sense if you're cold calling people, and that will really depend on who your audience is, who's in your panel, how their days are usually like. that all depends from how much research you've done into the people who are in your panel, I think. But yeah, for some, as long as you have consent and you have the legal grounds for connecting with them in that way and engaging them in that way, then it's absolutely fine. The worst thing that can happen is people just getting mad that you're calling them too often and
yeah, and I think the other piece of advice that I would give is that with the different methods that we've used historically, when, for example, we've been given a list of customers on behalf of a client to try and involve in research, because we wouldn't probably be cold calling people on our database because they've all opted in, and typically they've applied for a specific research project, and that's the point at which we call them. If we're cold calling through a customer list, we found that it is the most inefficient way to involve people in research, because it's very time consuming. You're often calling people when they're not available. If they don't recognise your number, a lot of people these days won't answer as well. And if you leave a voicemail and it's regarding something that they weren't aware that they were going to be contacted about, like a specific research project, they're unlikely to call you back, because it's likely it won't resonate with them and they'll think it's a scam, which is quite common, unfortunately. And it's something that we very rarely get asked to do these days in a sort of post-GDPR world. I think people are cottoning on to the fact that you have to think carefully about, actually, will people feel comfortable with this? Okay, so the last question that's on here is, can I build a panel of minors? I'm assuming they mean sort of young people.
Yes, yeah, I'm assuming they mean under 16. Yeah. I mean, technically, you can. There is no, there's nothing in the law, I believe, that makes it illegal. I'm not a lawyer, by the way, and this is not legal advice, disclaimer. But from my understanding of GDPR and the legal principles that apply to researching with minors, as long as there's consent from a guardian or a parent about you collecting data from their minor, then it is, I believe it is absolutely fine to have a panel with minors, as long as the parent or guardian is involved at every step of the way. Yeah, and is part of the process. I believe that's absolutely fine. But just be aware that with minors, for example, you should not be relying on, for example, verbal consent. You should be registering and collecting consent in a more official way. So you should, from the parents and guardians and from the minor, because the minor also needs to consent. That's very important to remind you. Just make sure that you're collecting and recording that consent in a bit of a more official way, not just on the phone, asking people, oh, can I talk to your kid? Yeah, so just make sure that you're keeping your records, that they are very organized, you have everything in place, all the GDPR principles you need to have in place. And also be aware that the legal age for digital consent in the UK is 13. So if you want them to directly join your panel, you need to have a block in place for people under 13. So I'm not sure who the person who's asking the question, what they are trying to build, so what age they're trying to target, but just be aware of that.
Bro, I'm going to wrap up there. If people have other questions that we haven't answered, please feel free to get in touch with us afterwards. So as a summary, get to know your audience, go where your users are, be ethical with your recruitment, which applies probably with your research as well. Analyze and report to monitor and sort of get a feel for it. You know, is your approach that you've chosen, is it successful? Is it working? Can you adapt it? Can you test it? Can you improve it? And get feedback from participants. See if they're happy with what you're doing. A few useful links. We have a blog. As Maria mentioned, we share case studies. We do collaborative content with clients that we've worked with, and we also do a newsletter which goes out quarterly. We do a monthly roundup with that as well, and every 6 months we do a magazine, a digital magazine, which has a bit more information about us, what we've been up to, just generally things about user recruitment, which I highly recommend everyone signing up to.
And just with the blog, I just wanted to mention, because I think I forgot when I was talking about the specific audiences, we have case studies on our blog about all the audiences I mentioned. So with the Alzheimer's Society on recruiting vulnerable audiences, with a couple of companies, sorry, I can't remember the names right now.
Robotics.
Yes, Reach Robotics, that's exactly it. On, for example, testing the world's first AR robot. And then finally with the DIT, the Department for International Trade, about recruiting people, business owners for niche usability testing.
Yeah, so go check that out. The MRS Code of Conduct is great because they do have guides regarding recruitment. They've actually got one just for the person that asked the question about minors. They've got a really useful guide about involving young people in research. And the UXPA Code of Conduct, it's there, but they don't really have as much information about participant recruitment. So yeah, if in doubt, sign up to our newsletter.
We don't have all the answers, but we do share a lot of our content. So.
We share a lot.
And you can always unsubscribe because it is GDPR friendly.
You can always
if you don't find it interesting.
Yeah. And feel free just to get in touch either on Twitter or via email if there's any other questions. And thanks again for joining.
Thank you.